The wind moved across the high plains like a lonely traveler who had forgotten where home was, carrying the faint smell of dust, pine smoke, and distant rain. The sky above the rugged frontier stretched wide as a promise no one could ever fully understand. In that land of wide rivers and buffalo trails, where the sun carved deep shadows into canyon walls and old life refused to surrender, a young woman stepped down from a slow-moving wagon, holding a worn satchel close to her heart. She had traveled a long way, farther than most women dared to go, all for a chance to escape a past that had chased her like a wolf on her heels. The townsfolk watched her with quiet interest, whispering about her arrival and the strange arrangement she had agreed to. Some spoke with pity, others with curiosity. But no one came forward to ask if she was scared. She had answered a mail-order bride post not because she dreamed of marriage, but because she needed shelter, protection, and a future she could claim as her own. Her clothes were plain, and her eyes looked older than her years. She had left behind memories she hoped would sink into dust, though she feared they would return like thunder that follows even the quietest sky. The envelope she carried still smelled of wood smoke and wild sage, sealed with a symbol she did not recognize until someone in the town told her it belonged to an Apache warrior known for his height, strength, and quiet ways. Rumors painted him like an untamed storm, a man who lived between two worlds and trusted neither. They said he had once lived among his people in the mountains, but now kept to himself in a weathered cabin beyond the edge of the settlement. No one dared to visit him uninvited. She felt her knees weaken when the man arrived to meet her. He came on horseback, silent as pine shadows, and every part of him looked carved from the same earth he walked on. His long dark hair was tied back, his shoulders were broad, and his eyes held a depth she could not read. He spoke little to the townsfolk and did not bow his head to judgment. Instead, he studied her with a steady gaze that felt neither cruel nor gentle, only truthful. When he nodded for her to mount his horse, her breath caught. Unsure if this road truly led toward freedom or something she could not escape, she climbed up behind him. They rode away from the last familiar voices she would hear for many miles. Their path wound through tall grass, cottonwood trees, and narrow trails shaped by hooves long before either of them was born. She held tight to her satchel and tried not to tremble. He spoke only once during the journey, saying that the land around them did not belong to fences or papers, but to the wind and the people who respected it. His voice carried the weight of old stories that lived longer than men. She wondered what made him seek a bride through written letters rather than through his own people, yet she could not gather the courage to ask. When they reached his cabin, she saw how isolated it stood, built of sturdy logs, surrounded by animal pelts, woven tools, and tracks that showed he had survived winters far worse than anything she could imagine. Inside, the cabin smelled of cedar, dried herbs, and warm earth. There's no sign of chaos or wild temper as the townsfolk whispered. Instead, everything felt carefully arranged, as though each object held a purpose. She kept waiting for him to speak words she feared would bind her forever. Instead, he placed a small wooden bowl before her, with cooked venison and berries, then sat across from her at the fire without asking who she was running from or what sorrow lay behind her eyes. She sensed that he already knew people only crossed the frontier like this when they had nothing left behind them but shadows. When he finally spoke again, his voice held neither threat nor softness, only truth carved by deep experience. He told her she would not be forced to stay, nor would she be made to live in fear inside his home. Then he said the line she never expected to hear. He told her that if she spent one night under his roof, without trying to run, without lying, and without hiding her truth, then freedom would be hers to choose with her own feet the next sunrise. She stared at him, unable to believe such a bargain. Many men promised freedom only to twist it like a rope. Her heart pounded as she tried to decide whether this was a trick, a test, or something older than marriage papers. He explained that he did not order a bride to claim ownership, but to offer a chance for a shared life if two souls proved they could trust rather than trade. She wondered why he chose her, but his silence gave no easy answers. Outside, night birds cried around the cabin, and the wind slid through cracks like a curious spirit. She thought of the long road she had taken, the letters exchanged, and the uncertainty that now wrapped around her like a blanket with torn seams. She asked him why he needed her to stay one night instead of letting her choose right away. He looked into the flames before answering, saying that every person carried a truth that revealed itself only in the quiet of darkness. He would not bind himself to someone whose heart still belonged to another place. She felt both challenged and frightened, unsure whether night would expose strength or weakness inside her. She wondered what he would do. He did not like what truth he saw. Her voice trembled as she asked if she would be safe. He stood slowly, walked to the door, and set his bow against the wall. He offered his word that she would be safe, and he would sleep outside by the fire so she would not fear sharing the room. Something inside her shifted, both relieved and unsure. With every passing moment, her thoughts tangled like thorn bushes. Should she trust him, or flee into the darkness with no map and no weapon against the cold? She knew that if she ran, the wild lands could swallow her before daylight. The cabin went quiet, lit only by firelight. She stood near the small window, gripping her satchel as though it held her soul. She could hear him settling outside, tending the flames like a guardian of stories never spoken. She realized the test was not about marriage, nor obedience, but about courage against the ghosts that hunted her. The sky outside grew darker. Thunder murmured far away. The plains whispered secrets that had existed long before her arrival. Her heart beat like a drum as she wondered what sunrise would bring. She wondered if she would walk away free, or if something inside her would change before morning in ways she could not undo. When she blew out the small flame in the lantern and darkness filled the cabin, she felt the weight of her choice pressing against her ribs like a closing door. Sleep would not come easy. The night had begun. She had no idea what truth it would demand from her. The darkness inside the cabin felt alive as she stood in the stillness, feeling every creak, every soft hum of wind against wood, and every echo of her own heartbeat. She placed her satchel on the small wooden table and sat down slowly, unsure if she should close her eyes or stay awake until dawn. The words he had spoken kept circling in her mind like a hawk over open grassland. Spend one night in his home, and freedom would be hers. It sounded so simple, but nothing in her life had ever been simple. Her past had taught her that safety often came with hidden strings, and promises often turned into traps. Still, something about his voice held a weight that made it difficult to believe he would lie. She looked around the room, letting her eyes adjust to the faint glow of the dying fire. There were furs placed near the wall, a small wooden chest, handmade tools, and a woven blanket that appeared worn from many cold nights. Everything spoke of a quiet life shaped by survival, not by greed or cruelty. Before she left the town, she had overheard a few whispers about the warrior she was going to meet. Some said he had once been feared among settlers, while others said he protected any woman or child lost on his lands. No one could agree which version was true, and fear always traveled louder than truth. Now sitting in his cabin, she felt there was more to him than anyone understood. His silence was not the same as danger, and his strength did not carry the scent of violence. He seemed like someone who had lived through something heavy, something that made him choose isolation over community. She wondered if he ever laughed, or if he carried memories that weighed heavier than winter snow. She thought back to how she found his mail order letter among a small pile left in the corner of an inn. She never meant to pick it, but her hands moved toward it like it was meant for her. His message was short and clear, written in strong handwriting. He wanted someone who sought not money, land, or protection alone, but a life where honesty and respect mattered more than comfort. He promised a fair bond, not forced commitment, and he wrote that he would not bend another soul to his will. She did not know then just how different that offer was from what she had known. Her past had been shaped by men who demanded rather than offered, took rather than gave, and believed a woman's voice held less worth than dry soil. She had escaped that world through quiet determination and an opportunity she prayed would not become another cage. Back in the cabin, she pulled the blanket around her shoulders and closed her eyes for a moment. She could hear the warrior outside tending to the fire. And even though he was not inside, she felt his presence like a shield around the cabin. She wondered what his life had been before he chose to live alone. She had heard how his people once roamed free, following the seasons, teaching their children to read signs of nature, and singing stories that kept their history alive. But the land had changed when strangers came, building fences and claiming soil with ink rather than ancestry. Battles had been fought, families had been separated, and many who once walked proudly now walked with quiet grief. Maybe he carried some part of that story in his eyes, and maybe the world had forced him to become something neither side fully accepted. Outside, a sudden howl of wind made her open her eyes again. She slowly walked toward the small window, seeing nothing but dark sky and faint sparks rising from his fire. She wondered why he lived so far from everyone else, yet close enough to receive mail. Perhaps he wanted distance without being forgotten. She thought about asking him in the morning if she stayed long enough to see it. The longer she stood in the room, the more she realized that she had been given something rare, something she'd never expected to find in the wild frontier. She had been given a choice. She could stay through the night and trust that dawn would bring answers, or she could run into the unknown and let fear lead her again. She walked back to the table and opened her satchel to remind herself why she had left her old life behind. Inside was a folded cloth, a piece of bread, and a small carved figurine given to her by someone she once cared for. Holding the little object in her palm brought a sting behind her eyes. She remembered a warm voice promising that life would someday be kind, even though kindness felt like a distant legend. But she had learned something from every step of her journey. Pain could turn a person cold, but it could also turn a person wise. She wiped her eyes and closed the satchel again, realizing she did not come this far just to be ruled by fear. Outside, she heard movement and curiosity made her slowly crack the door open. The warrior sat close to the fire, sharpening a tool with slow, steady movements. He looked toward her but did not speak. His calm silence felt like another language that did not need extra words. She wanted to ask him so many things. Why he chose her, what his past held, what he hoped for, and why one night mattered so much. Instead, she simply asked if he ever regretted living away from others. His eyes moved to the fire before answering. He explained that humans often spoke without understanding the cost of their words, and he preferred to live where actions were clearer than promises. He said the land gave him truth because it could not lie. She sat near the doorway while he worked, the fire casting soft light against his strong features. She could see careful scars on his arm, each one telling a story that did not need to be spoken aloud. She finally asked him why he wanted someone who arrived through written letters, rather than through his tribe or neighboring towns. He paused before answering, as if choosing words that would not be misunderstood. He said he was not looking for someone who came from duty or expectation. He wanted someone who knew what it meant to walk through hardship and still choose hope over bitterness. She wondered if he was describing her or himself. He asked her if she feared him. She hesitated, not wanting to offend nor lie. She admitted that she did not know him enough to fear or trust him, but she feared what life could turn into if she made another wrong choice. His expression remained steady as he said fear was never shameful, only running from it without facing truth was. She stayed there a little longer, letting the warmth of the fire ease the tension inside her. She realized she was learning more about him through quiet moments than she ever could through long explanations. After a while, he stood and placed another log on the fire. He told her she should rest, and dawn would decide what needed to be known. There was no threat in his tone, only certainty. She walked back inside, feeling a strange mix of nerves and comfort. She lay down on the furs, listening to the faint crackle of the fire outside and the distant sound of night creatures. She wondered if the land itself was testing her, watching her choice with ancient eyes. She closed her eyes and tried to breathe slow, telling herself that sunrise would come no matter what fear tried to whisper. What she did not know was that the warrior outside was fighting his own thoughts. He had chosen her not because he needed a bride, but because something in her words felt familiar. He could sense she carried secrets. He feared that if she left in the morning without trust, she would carry danger with her. The night grew deeper and colder, and both of them lay awake in different places, unsure of the truth that waited for morning. The question hanging silently in the air was whether the test was truly hers alone, or if he too was standing at the edge of a choice he could not take back. The fire burned low, and the land held its breath, waiting for dawn to decide what path their lives would take next. She woke before the sun, unsure if she had slept at all. The faint gray of early morning pushed against the window, and the cabin felt colder, as if the night had taken something from her and had not yet given anything back. For a moment she forgot where she was, then the memory of the long ride, the quiet Apache warrior, and his strange bargain returned in a rush. Spend one night in his home, and freedom would be hers. She lay still on the furs, listening. Outside she could hear the soft crackle of coals and the low murmur of a man speaking to his horse in a language that carried the spirit of the land itself. She sat up and pulled the blanket around her shoulders, feeling the weight of the day waiting just beyond the door. This was the morning that would decide everything, yet nothing felt clear. Her fear had not vanished with darkness, but something else had grown. A restless curiosity about the man whose life stood separate from towns, laws, and fences. She walked to the small basin, splashed her face with cold water, and saw in her reflection a woman who looked both older and more alive than the girl who had left the boarding house weeks before. Her eyes held questions that would not be quiet. When she stepped outside, the chill bit her skin, but the air felt clean in a way that city streets never did. The warrior stood near a small corral, tightening the rope on a rail. His horse, a strong bay with a dark mane, lifted its head and snorted. He greeted her with a short nod, his expression unreadable. For a breath she wondered if he had changed his mind about his promise. She searched his face for any sign of anger or regret, but found only the same calm watchfulness. He asked if she had slept. She answered that she had tried. He did not smile, yet something softened in his gaze. Like a stone warmed by sunlight, he handed her a wooden cup filled with warm broth made from bones and herbs. She thanked him and drank, feeling strength seep back into her limbs. The land around the cabin stretched wide, hills rising in the distance, cottonwoods marking the line of a hidden creek. Smoke from the dying fire curled upward, carrying the scent of juniper. She could not deny the beauty of the frontier, even though danger lurked along its edges. While she stood there, taking it in, he spoke again, asking if she still hoped to claim her freedom after this morning, or if she wished to speak of staying. The question should have been simple, but it felt heavy. Instead of answering, she asked him what he believed freedom truly meant. Many men she had known used the word freely, yet their idea of freedom had always meant her obedience. He considered her for a moment. Then he said freedom was not running from everything, nor was it living without responsibility. It was choosing who you walk beside and where you plant your feet, even when the world disapproves. His words struck her because they echoed thoughts she had carried in secret. She looked at him, trying to see whether he was a man shaped by pride or by loss. He, in turn, wished to know more about the stranger who had arrived at his door. The letters they had exchanged told him little. Paper did not hold the way a person moved, or the way fear sat in their eyes. He asked why she had chosen his advertisement when there were others written by ranchers, shopkeepers, and clerks in growing towns. Her fingers tightened around the cup. Part of her wanted to keep her past buried, to hold her story like a locked chest. Yet the bargain he made spoke of truth. The night had forced her to consider how long she could keep, running without ever standing still long enough to face what hunted her. So she began to tell him, slowly, as if each word might break in her mouth. She told him about the crowded boarding house, where she washed clothes until her hands felt raw, and where men who walked in with silver on their belts believed that desperation made every woman easy prey. She spoke of one man in particular, a rancher who owned more cattle than most people could count. He had seen her hanging laundry and decided she would make a fine addition to his house, whether she agreed or not. At first he came with compliments, then with gifts, then with threats. When she refused to be bought, he used the law like a whip, claiming she owed him money she had never taken. The owner of the boarding house grew scared and pushed her out, saying she attracted trouble. She told the warrior how she had gone to the small-town church seeking help, only to find the rancher talking quietly with the preacher and the sheriff. The sight of the three men together had chilled her to the bone. She realized she stood alone against a circle of power that would close on her like barbed wire. That same night, she packed what little she had and fled to another town downriver, where she found the mail-order board. His letter had stood apart because it did not sound like a bargain for ownership. It sounded like a man asking to share ground, not claim it. Though she still feared that even honest words could hide a trap, the warrior listened without interrupting. When she finished, he crouched near the fire and stirred the coals with a stick, deep in thought. He told her he knew of men like that rancher. In his younger days, he had seen how certain settlers used law papers to steal land that had held his people's stories for generations. He said that some fights were not won with weapons, but with quiet strength and patience. And sometimes a person had to step sideways, out of reach, to find a new way to resist. Her decision to leave had been such a step, even if it felt more like running. While they spoke, the land around them slowly woke. Birdsong drifted from the trees, and the sky turned from gray to pale blue. Yet beneath the calm, a quiet unease moved in the warrior's gut. He had noticed something before dawn. While fetching water from the creek, he had seen faint tracks near the rise above his cabin. They were not his, nor were they from travelers passing through. The prints showed shod horses, the kind favored by ranchers and town riders, not wanderers. He had not told her yet because he needed to be sure. He suspected someone had followed, maybe from the town where he met her, maybe from farther away. Now, as she finished speaking, he finally shared what he had seen. He told her about the tracks and the way the earth had been pressed by more than one rider. Her face went pale and the cup shook in her hand. She asked if the riders could still be near. He answered that he did not know, but the prints were fresh enough to stir concern. She whispered that the rancher had vowed she would pay for leaving. If he had money and friends near the law, he would not hesitate to send men after her. Men who believed anything on the frontier could be claimed with threat and gun. The air between them tightened. The simple question of whether she would stay or go now twisted into something larger. If she left his cabin at dawn as a free woman, traveling alone, she might ride straight into the arms of the men searching for her. If she stayed, she might bring their trouble to his doorstep. The warrior had spent years keeping conflict away from his isolated home. Now trouble had followed a frightened mail-order bride straight into his quiet world, and he had to decide whether to send her back into the storm or stand with her in the middle of it. He walked to the edge of the hill and scanned the distant horizon. The land seemed empty, yet he knew how easily men could hide in shallow ravines, behind brush or among scattered rocks. He felt the old instinct of a scout rise in his bones. The training from his youth when he learned how to read the earth like a page. He saw a faint line of dust far off, so thin it could have been a trick of light. His hand tightened near the knife at his belt. If riders were indeed circling, they would come at the time most men grew careless, when the sun climbed high and shadows shrank. Back at the cabin, she paced the small yard, torn between guilt and fear. She had not meant to bring danger to anyone. She had written to him because she believed the distance and the wild land might break the reach of the rancher's power. Now she faced the terrible thought that he might find her anyway, destroying anything that stood in his path. She asked the warrior if he regretted answering her letter. He told her regret was a waste of breath, while danger still walked near. What mattered now was what they did with the few moments the land granted them. Before trouble arrived, a new tension took root between them. Until now, their conflict had lived mostly inside their thoughts, a question of trust and choice. Now, an outer threat pressed in, turning the quiet valley into a place of waiting. The warrior began to prepare as only a man who had lived through many fights could. He checked his bowstring, examined the arrows, and moved a small stash of supplies to a hollow near the back of the cabin. He made sure the horse could be cut loose quickly if he needed to draw attention away from the house. She watched, feeling equal parts protected and terrified. Knowing each measured action meant he believed danger was real, yet another layer of conflict began to grow within him. He had once sworn not to be drawn into the endless quarrels of settlers, lawmen, and greedy ranchers. He had wanted a life where the battles of other men did not reach his door.
Yes.
a life where he answered only to the rhythm of seasons and spirit of his people. Taking in a mail-order bride from that world now threatened to pull him back into the same circle of violence he had walked away from. By helping her, he might become a target yet again, losing the fragile peace he had built. By turning her away, he might save himself, but abandon someone who had chosen his home as a last refuge. Inside the cabin, she opened her satchel again and took out the small carved figurine, a little wooden bird with wings spread. It had belonged to her mother, who used to say birds knew the secret of real freedom because they trusted the sky. She held it close, asking herself if freedom meant leaving this place at sunrise, or if true freedom meant standing still and facing the storm with someone beside her. She had never stood beside anyone in a fight before, always alone, always pushing through with quiet endurance. The thought of trusting someone else with her struggle both frightened and tempted her, while they wrestled with their separate thoughts. The land slowly shifted around them. The dust line on the horizon thickened almost too faint to notice, like breath on glass. Somewhere out there, riders moved with purpose, guided by a trail that grew clearer with each step. The rancher's men, or whoever followed, carried their own idea of order, one where a woman's choice meant nothing compared to a man's pride. They were drawing closer to the lonely cabin of a towering Apache warrior and the mail-order bride who stood at the center of a promise that might soon be tested in ways neither of them yet understood. The sun climbed higher, and the wind changed direction, bringing with it the distant sound of hooves filtered through open space. The warrior turned his head sharply, eyes narrowing, ears reading the rhythm of the land like a drum. The young woman felt it too, a faint vibration through the soil under her boots. Their gazes met, and in that silent exchange lay all the questions they still had no time to ask. The faint vibration through the ground grew steadier, like a slow drumbeat carried by the wind. She felt her breath catch as the warrior stepped to the edge of the small clearing, scanning the direction of the rising dust. The look in his eyes changed, not to fear, but to focus. The way someone trained for danger read every sign before it arrived. She moved closer, gripping her arms to steady herself, and asked whether the riders could be hunters or travelers passing by. He answered quietly that hunters did not ride in groups of more than two, and travelers did not move with speed unless something pushed them forward. The land itself was warning them, and he trusted it more than he trusted men. He told her not to panic, but she could hear something beneath his voice, not fear, but readiness. He began to prepare without rushing. He handed her a small canteen and a cloth bag containing dried meat and berries, then pointed toward a narrow path behind the cabin that led into thick brush and small boulders. He told her that if anything happened, she should take that trail until it disappeared into the trees along the creek. The idea of running again twisted inside her stomach. After all the miles she had traveled, she had come to his home seeking a place where she would not have to run anymore. She looked at him with trembling eyes and said she did not want to hide. He paused for the first time since sensing the danger. He told her that courage was not always standing in front of harm, and sometimes survival carried more strength than pride. She held the small carved bird between her palms, remembering what her mother once said. Birds did not flee because they feared, but because they knew where safety helped them live to fly again. Even so, something in her heart resisted retreat, not because she doubted the threat, but because she did not want to abandon the first place that had offered her truth instead of chains. The warrior watched her closely, seeing the war inside her eyes. He understood such choices, for he had made a similar one long ago when he left his people to live in quiet places, where battle would not shape the rest of his life. Now he faced a choice he never expected. He moved his hand gently, not touching her, but close enough that she felt the support he offered. He told her she would not face anything alone, but if she wished to stay, she must trust his judgment and remain near him, not charge into fear blindly. She nodded in agreement, though her hands shook. They moved back toward the cabin, but the warrior paused at a tall cedar tree where he had hung several handmade wind charms that chimed lightly when danger came near. Only one charm moved, the one facing the west, confirming the rider's direction. He did not show alarm. yet his shoulders tightened slightly, revealing more than his words ever would. She glanced up at him and realized how deeply he knew this land. How connected he was to signs most people never noticed. Before the riders could come into full sight, he decided they needed to appear calm and unthreatening. He led her inside the cabin and closed the door halfway. He took his bow and placed it gently against the wall, not outside where it could be mistaken as a threat, but close enough that he could reach it if needed. He reminded her once more that not every rider brought danger, but it was wiser to prepare than to regret. She watched him move, impressed by his silent grace, like someone who lived with the land rather than on it. Her heart beat faster as hoofbeats became more defined, no longer a distant tremor but a clear rhythm approaching. She positioned herself near the small window, her fingers curled around her satchel. Even though she knew there was nothing inside that could protect her except memories and courage, the sound of riders slowed. Voices began to cut through the air. The warrior stepped outside first, walking with calm strength, not hiding, not bowing, and not reaching for a weapon. When she leaned slightly to see through the window, she counted 3 horses, each carrying a man wearing long coats and hats pulled low. Their horses snorted and stomped restlessly, sensing tension beneath the surface. One man spoke first, asking if the warrior had seen a woman traveling alone, scribed with details matching her perfectly. Her breath halted, but the warrior answered with steady words, saying many travelers passed through the plains, and he did not question where they came from or where they were going. The men exchanged looks, appearing unconvinced. One of them said the woman they sought had fled from a man who considered her property, that they were doing the law a service by retrieving her. The warrior met their eyes with a look that held both silence and steel. He calmly replied that no human belonged to another, and land like this did not recognize such claims. The riders grew impatient, saying the matter was not his concern. The warrior answered that anything brought to his ground with threat or force was his concern. Inside the cabin, she pressed her palm against her chest, trying to steady her breathing. Her eyes filled with tears, not from fear alone, but from hearing someone defend her right to exist freely. She knew the situation could shift into danger at any moment, yet something inside her no longer felt like a helpless wanderer. She had believed her presence might ruin his quiet life, but now she sensed he made his choice long before the sun rose. Not to abandon her, but to stand where truth mattered more than fear. The riders asked to search his property, claiming legal authority. The warrior replied firmly that the right they spoke of did not exist on land, where treaties were broken and promises made to his people had turned to dust. His voice remained calm, neither raised nor trembling, yet the men recognized that pushing further might provoke more than they were prepared for. One rider leaned from his saddle and told him that they would not leave for long and they had all the time they needed. He warned that trouble would come again, stronger than before, and when it did, living in the wilderness would not shelter him. They turned their horses and rode off slowly, not fleeing, but circling back toward distant hills. The warrior watched until their figures disappeared, then walked inside the cabin, closing the door behind him. She looked at him with anxious eyes and asked if they had truly left. He shook his head slightly, saying they had only withdrawn for now. She asked if they would return. His silence gave the answer. He sat down, placing his bow across his knees, not with panic, but deep thought. She walked closer and thanked him, though words felt too small. He did not answer with grand statements. He simply said that right choices often came with cost. And both of them now carried that weight. The rest of the day moved slowly, as though time stretched itself thin. Neither of them spoke much, but they worked side by side, securing small things that could become important if they needed to move quickly. He showed her where water could be stored, how to close shutters without making noise, and how to listen for sounds that did not belong to nature. She tried each task carefully, wanting to learn rather than depend blindly, as the sun lowered. They shared a quiet meal inside, though neither tasted much. The air felt heavy with waiting, but as hours passed, something unspoken changed between them. She began to see he was not simply protecting his land, he was protecting the principle of freedom he valued more than comfort. And he began to see she was not simply a frightened bride, but a woman who had walked through storms without losing her soul entirely. When evening shadows covered the valley, he finally spoke of a choice they must face. He said they could prepare to leave and travel toward a distant settlement where he knew someone who might help, but the journey would be long. And if the riders followed, danger would follow too. Or they could stay, holding ground, knowing the risk that came with it. She asked him which he preferred, and he answered honestly that his life had been shaped by journeys. But the land he lived on held memories and meaning that could not be replaced without loss. She took a long breath and admitted that running had exhausted her spirit, and she had lost enough ground already. This place, even with danger near, felt more like beginning than escape. His eyes met hers, and in that look, something warm and wordless passed between them. Yet even with that new understanding, the threat outside grew stronger. As night deepened, they heard distant hoofbeats again, softer, sneaking rather than approaching boldly. The warrior rose slowly and took his bow, then looked at her with a seriousness that made her heart pound. She stepped closer, feeling fear and strength rise together. He whispered that whatever came next, they would face it with truth, not surrender. Outside, a faint light flickered through the trees, and the cold wind carried voices once more. The moment to choose action was no longer distant. It stood at their door waiting. He moved quietly toward the door, motioning for her to stay low near the wall where the shadows could hide her. She sank to her knees, watching him through the dim glow of the fire, feeling every heartbeat like it was too loud for the night. The distant voices outside shifted from whispers to muted commands, and she knew the riders had come back. Not with questions this time, but with a decision already formed. For a moment, her mind began to slip toward panic, wondering if this peaceful place that had finally felt like a beginning would soon turn into another memory she would have to bury. But then she looked at the warrior and felt something stronger than fear. He was not moving like someone preparing for a hopeless fight. He moved like a man anchored by purpose. He picked up a small leather pouch from the table and tied it at his belt, then took a thick stick from near the fireplace. Not as a weapon, but as a tool he planned to use with intention. When he opened the door, he stepped outside without hesitation and let the cold night air surround him. She crawled toward the window to see, but she stayed hidden as he asked the hidden riders to show themselves with calm firmness. A long silence followed, then 3 figures stepped out slowly from behind the trees, holding lanterns rather than rifles pointed forward. Their movements were tense, but not reckless, and their eyes studied the warrior with caution. They expected him to act wild or defensive, but his stillness kept them unsure. She could hear their voices clearly. Their leader said they had come with final warning and were prepared to take the woman by force if necessary. Before they could continue, the warrior stepped forward slightly and said that he wished to speak with only the leader, not with men who leaned on fear to prove their power. The other 2 hesitated but took a few steps back, waiting for a signal. The leader looked annoyed at first, but curiosity made him accept. He walked forward until he stood only a few feet away, and the warrior lowered his voice to speak, though she could not hear every word. She caught enough to know that the warrior had chosen truth as his shield, rather than arrows or threats. He told the leader that some men fight by steel and others fight by spirit, and that the woman they were after had never belonged to anyone. He explained that chasing her would not return honor or bring peace to any of them, because power gained through fear always grows weaker when challenged by truth. The leader stared at him, confused for a moment, maybe even shaken, as if no one had spoken to him like that before. After a long pause, the warrior reached into the leather pouch at his belt and held out a small carved stone shaped like a mountain peak. He said it came from his people, a reminder that strength must come with balance or it breaks itself. The leader hesitated but took the stone in his hand. Something in his eyes softened, like he was seeing beyond the night and into himself. He lowered his lantern slightly and said he had never wanted to be part of hunting a woman, but he owed a debt to the rancher who had asked for her return. The warrior told him that debts can be paid in ways that do not destroy innocent lives, and that if he walked away tonight he could live with clean hands. For a long moment, no one moved. Then slowly, the leader nodded and turned his head toward the other 2 riders. They watched him with confusion, but he ordered them to turn around and leave. He told them that whatever reward the rancher had promised was no longer worth the cost. They stared at him with disbelief, but they obeyed. With no further words, they rode back into the darkness, the sound of their hooves fading into silence. The leader remained for a moment longer, looking at the warrior as if searching for something to say. Then finally he spoke, saying that the world would be better if more men chose truth over pride. He placed the carved stone inside his coat and promised not to return. Then he mounted his horse and left without looking back. She felt her entire body release a breath she had been holding since the moment she left the boarding house weeks ago. Tears slid down her face quietly, not just from relief, but from realization that this time she had not been saved by luck or running. She had been protected by truth and honor, something she had believed no longer existed in the world. When the warrior walked back into the cabin, she stood to meet him, unable to speak at first. He removed the pouch from his belt and set it on the table, as if closing a chapter. She whispered a thank you, but he shook his head gently and said the choice had been shared, not carried by one. She asked if he believed the riders would keep their word. He answered that the leader had looked like a man who recognized the weight of his choice and would not want to carry shame any further. She looked into his calm eyes and realized that he had faced the night with courage, not for reward, but because his spirit would not bend to fear or injustice. She then told him something she had never spoken aloud to anyone. She wanted a life where she could give back strength, not only take shelter from it. They sat near the fire as warmth crept back into the room. The tension of the night melted slowly into a quiet calm. She felt like she could finally breathe without fear chasing each breath. Then the warrior asked her again, not as a test, but as a simple and honest invitation. He asked whether she wanted to stay in his home not as a bargain or as a mail-order bride, but as someone choosing a shared path freely. She looked around the cabin, feeling the silence as a friend rather than a threat, and realized that the freedom she sought was not just about leaving danger behind, but about finding a place where trust could grow. She answered softly that she wished to stay, not because she had nowhere else to go, but because the place felt like the first true home she had ever stepped into. He nodded with quiet acceptance, not celebrating loudly, but carrying the moment like something sacred. He told her that if they were to build a life together, it would be done with shared work, shared decisions, and shared truth. She agreed, feeling peace settle inside her like roots finding soil in the weeks that followed. The valley became not just a shelter, but a shared world. They worked side by side, tending to the land, preparing small gardens, gathering herbs, and creating simple comforts. She learned how to use the land not as a stranger, but as someone who belonged. He learned how to speak more openly, sharing stories from his childhood, songs taught by elders, and memories shaped by mountains and rivers. She shared pieces of her past, little by little, and they burned them in the fire, not to forget. But to honor survival, the carved bird she carried found a place above the cabin door, a reminder that freedom lives where truth is welcomed. And though the world outside still held challenges, she no longer feared the unknown. She now walked beside someone who understood life beyond borders and taught her that true strength does not shout or demand. It stands as quiet as a mountain, but never bows to darkness. Seasons changed gently around them, and happiness grew like wildflowers that needed no approval to bloom. Their bond became not one of contract, but of trust, shaped by simple promises spoken in soft voices. The valley no longer felt like a hiding place. It felt like the beginning of a life built on honesty, dignity, and shared hope. And as she watched the horizon each morning, she no longer wondered whether she was free. She knew she had chosen freedom with her own heart, and it had chosen her back.